Welcome back. This particular section, we're going to talk about gender, the differences between biological sexual characteristics and then the social constructs of gender, what it means to be male and female. So, first off, sex is referring to the natural or biological differences that distinguish males and females. Males have penises, females don't. They have vaginas. And then there's a few people in our society that have cases where they have a combination of both. Sexuality is referring to the desire or the sexual preference, sexual identity and behavior. And gender is a social construct that consists of a set of social arrangements that are built around sex. Essentially, we made that up. We made gender up. Understanding the differences between these terms is essential for understanding the concepts throughout the section. So we're going to spend the next few minutes making sure we're all clear about the three terms. Sometimes in our society, we see the terms sex and gender used interchangeably, but as I just argued there, it's not true. For instance, on a job application, you might see a checkbox that says to select your gender, followed by the words male or female. This is actually an inappropriate use of the term gender. The application is actually referring to sex. And you have to ask yourself, why do you think someone might use the term gender rather than sex? So sex, of course, is a process in the making. How we construct sex is a social construction as well. Many believe that there are only two sexes, male and female, and that all people fall into one group or the other. However, there's plenty of evidence that is not actually accurate. The study of gender involves looking very closely at the relationship between this concept of nature and nurture, and not assuming that one overshadows the other or that there's a clear line separating the two. It's common to think that there are only two sexes, male and female, because those are the only two that we really emphasize and have allowed to be acceptable in society, at least for most of us. And that all people fall into one group or the other. And indeed, this is a way of imposing order on a chaotic world. But nature's never that simple. There's evidence to suggest that we need to embrace a more expansive definition of sex, one that goes beyond two rigid and distinct categories, possibly talking about a third way. About 1 in 1,000 babies are born intersexed or hermaphroditic, which means having an abnormal chromosomal makeup and mixed or indeterminate male and female sexual characteristics. This is a function of biology. Gender, on the other hand, is different because it relates to the way that a person behaves and is based on biological sex. In other words, we learn how to act manly or womanly based on the sex that we're born as. Girls are raised to be girls and boys are raised to be boys, and those two roles are very different. So what does it take to be a man or a woman? Well, gender roles are sets of behavioral norms assumed to accompany one's status as a male or a female. Evidence shows that gender roles have more to do with social status than biology. Think for a second about whether you can identify specific examples of gender role socialization in your own lives. For instance, were you ever told that a specific behavior wasn't appropriate because you were either a boy or a girl? Or did you ever receive a harsher or more lenient punishment because they felt you were a boy or a girl? But once you start to think about how these things have played out in your life and how they've affected who you've become, they begin to jump off the page. Once you start to look for gender cues, you see them everywhere because the construction of gender is so hegemonic. It's everywhere. Everything we do is in many respects related to our gender identity. When you talk about gender, you also are going to ultimately talk about feminism. And feminism is an intellectual consciousness-raising movement based on the idea that women and men should be accorded equal opportunities and respect. In the United States, the history of the women's movement can be divided into three historical waves. That first wave was the earliest period of feminist activism and included the period from the mid-19th century until American women won the right to vote in 1920. This campaign organized around gaining voting rights for women and was called the suffrage movement. The second period was the period of feminist activity during the 1960s and the 1970s, which is often associated with the issues of women's equal access to employment and education. And the third wave is the most recent period of feminist activity, and it's focusing on issues of diversity and the variety of identities that women can possess. Each movement takes on a different set of aspects because the previous movement has solved the problems that they were addressing, and it allows the feminists to dig deeper, to become more complex in what they're arguing and striving for within the social universe. Feminism also seeks to get people to understand that gender is an organizing principle in life. As I said, it's all-encompassing, and that gender structures social relations on unequal ground, and thus power is fundamentally at play when we talk about gender differences. One of the things that we have to talk about when we talk about gender differences is, as it is within any conversations about power distribution, it's as much about who we don't talk about as who we do talk about. Very rarely do we construct the male side of gender, but we always construct the female side of gender. This brings us to the woman question. A wide range of theories and approaches have been applied to the study of gender, including structural functionalism, some psychoanalysis, conflict theory, the micro-interactionist theories, postmodern theories, and of course ideas from Black feminists. Each of these perspectives has contributed to our understanding of gender differences and gender roles. And no doubt other theories or approaches will emerge in the future. When assessing these various approaches, it's important to ask yourself how useful each one is for explaining people's experiences and behaviors in their lives and in yours. When we think about the structural functionalist approach of studying gender, it's assuming that gender differences exist to fulfill necessary functions in society. It doesn't allow for the possibility that other structures could fulfill the same function, or the fact that structures change throughout history. A good example of structural functionalism in gender studies is Talcott Parsons' sex role theory. This theory suggests that men and women perform their sex roles as breadwinners and wives and mothers, respectively, because the nuclear family is the ideal arrangement in modern societies. Functionalists tend to believe that society functions in the way it does as a result of men and women having different roles and different tasks. Functionalists would argue that sometimes these differences result in inequalities, but that there is a purpose for this division in society, and some people are going to be disadvantaged because that purpose is being fulfilled. Psychoanalysis It's focusing on individualistic explanations for gender differences as opposed to societal ones, as the psychologists tend to do. It's inherent in these theories is the notion that there are natural differences between men and women that dictate how they behave. When we think about this, we think about Sigmund Freud. Freudian theorists have provided an overly individualistic psychoanalysis of sex roles. Although biological determinism plays a major role in Freudian theory, so does the idea that gender develops through family socialization. Freud does accept that gender roles are socially constructed. Conflict theories argue that patriarchy in a capitalist system benefit those who have the most, and it ultimately subordinates women. They point out that men stand to lose a great deal if gender inequality disappears. For example, they would have to do more unpaid work or pay to have their homes kept up and children cared for. They also argue that they're interested in the imbalance of power in society and the struggles that people go through trying to gain access to power that they traditionally have not had access to. In many societies, it's clear that women have not had access to power, and oftentimes they still lack access to power, even in societies that have distributed that power more fairly. Gender inequality can be found in all past and present societies, and it invariably takes the form of patriarchy or male domination. The socialist feminists are arguing that all social relations, including relations between workers and the owners of the means of production, stem from unequal gender relations. Essentially, social feminists try to get people to understand that all aspects of their lives are influenced by gender. Social constructionists argue that gender and its importance and meaning in the society are constructed by that society. In other words, society assigns the meanings to gender, and then we hold people accountable to those meanings. And the black feminists are arguing that gender doesn't function in a vacuum. Gender studies must take into account that there is no single category of women or men. This is related to the concept of double jeopardy by Francis Beale. Double jeopardy, or to be a black and female. Patricia Collins also talks about it as the triple threat of oppression. And what they're talking about is that being a member of one minority group may have certain disadvantages, but being a member of multiple minority groups amplifies those disadvantages even more. While black feminists might focus on the disadvantages of being a racial minority and a woman, there are other disadvantaged groups that should be considered as well. For instance, advantages might be available to able-bodied people, native English speakers, people who are bilingual, and people who are attractive, people who are fluent, and so on. We can give benefit to all different sorts of people and disadvantage others equally.